There are moments in history when the world stops, not because of what was expected, but because of what no one saw coming. This is one of those moments. You've heard the headlines, you've seen the spin, but what you're about to hear will take you deeper, beyond the noise, beyond the politics, into the heart of a response that shocked world powers, defied expectations, and forced even the most powerful nations to pause. This isn't just a story about Iran. This is about a nation that stood up when the world assumed it would fall silent. A nation that rewrote the rules, not with chaos, but with control. Not with fear, but with calculated force. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you won't just understand what happened. You'll understand why it matters to you, to Europe, to the balance of power, and to the future of how nations fight, speak, and rise. This is the moment the world changed and most people missed it. But let's begin. Iran's retaliatory strike marked a turning point, not just in military tactics, but in global perception of its capabilities. The world has long viewed Iran as a country limited by sanctions, held back by outdated technology, and boxed into a corner by powerful adversaries. But what unfolded during its recent response was far more advanced and deliberate than most global analysts had predicted. The operation was not a desperate act of aggression, it was a carefully executed show of modern warfare proficiency, signaling a new phase in Iran's defense doctrine. What surprised the observers the most wasn't just that Iran responded, but how it did so, with accuracy, coordination, and technical sophistication. Missile systems, once dismissed as primitive, suddenly showed precision targeting. UAVs and long-range drones were deployed with near-surgical accuracy, bypassing layers of regional defense and hitting their intended marks with chilling effectiveness. The strike wasn't chaotic or symbolic. It was cold, calculated, and timed with discipline. It showed that Iran wasn't merely reacting emotionally, but demonstrating the capability to send a clear message while controlling escalation. It was controlling escalation. Western military experts and intelligence agencies were caught off guard by the efficiency and effectiveness of the assault. And this led to a flurry of reassessments within defense ministries across the world. For years, military analysts assumed that Iran's hardware, while threatening, lacked the precision and integration seen in top-tier armed forces. That assumption was shattered. What Iran unveiled wasn't just a better missile, it was a better understanding of information warfare, psychological timing, and geopolitical signaling. The country demonstrated it could carry out an advanced retaliatory action without triggering a full-scale war. Walking a tightrope between deterrence and diplomacy with a level of control rarely attributed to regional powers. It also revealed an internal shift, a military doctrine that emphasizes agility, hybrid tactics, and modernized coordination across different branches of its defense network. Furthermore, the strike was laced with symbolic intelligence. It targeted areas that would cause strategic embarrassment, not mass casualties. This kind of precision warfare, once the domain of NATO or US forces, had now been effectively executed by a nation considered an outsider to global military sophistication. In doing so, Iran not only shocked its adversaries, but forced the international community to take its military evolution seriously. The ripple effect extended beyond the battlefield. It hit boardrooms, intelligence hubs, and newsrooms. Iran's response sent immediate shockwaves across European capitals, disrupting diplomatic routines and forcing a reevaluation of regional and international priorities. For many European nations, particularly those with historical ties to the Middle East, the retaliation marked a pivotal moment, one that challenged long-standing assumptions about the balance of power in the region. What had previously been dismissed as a localized or containable conflict now felt dangerously close, with implications that stretched far beyond the borders of Iran or its adversaries. In cities like Berlin, Brussels, Paris, and London, urgent high-level meetings were convened. Security councils scrambled to assess the situation. Intelligence services rechecked threat levels and vulnerabilities, not just in the Middle East, but on European soil. Europe has long maintained a complicated relationship with Iran, trying to balance diplomatic engagement with transatlantic pressure from the United States. But this response shattered the illusion that Europe could stay neutral or distant from the consequences of escalating tensions. The fear was not just about another war in the Middle East. It was about the potential unraveling of diplomatic frameworks that had kept Europe's energy supplies, trade routes, and regional partnerships stable. The suddenness and scale of Iran's strike forced European leaders to reckon with the reality that conflict in the region could now have a direct impact on their national interests. Energy security became one of the first and most urgent concerns. Many European nations rely heavily on energy shipments that pass through or near the Strait of Hormuz, a choke point that could easily become a target in a broader confrontation. Markets reacted instantly, with oil prices spiking and economic analysts warning of instability in supply chains. The incident highlighted just how vulnerable Europe remains to geopolitical flare-ups in the Middle East, despite years of attempting to diversify energy sources and routes. At a strategic level, the Iranian response prompted new conversations within NATO and the European Union. Defense autonomy, military readiness, and crisis response mechanisms were put under renewed scrutiny. What had once seemed like distant concerns suddenly appeared urgent. Questions were raised about the future of European diplomacy in the Middle East, about the reliability of current alliances, and about the continent's ability to defend its own interests in an increasingly multipolar world. Iran's strike didn't just send a military message, it forced Europe to acknowledge the changing nature of power projection and vulnerability in the modern era. Iran's latest response triggered a dramatic shift in its international reputation, particularly in the eyes of European observers who had long seen the country through the lens of sanctions, isolation, and outdated military capability. For decades, Iran was portrayed as a pariah state, rhetorically defiant, but practically limited, more bluster than bite. That perception was deeply ingrained in Western media, policy discussions, and think tank reports. However, the precision, discipline, and effectiveness of Iran's strike challenged these assumptions in real time. It marked a rare moment where narrative, long repeated by global powers, was upended, not by words, but by action. The response showcased a nation that had not only evolved militarily, but had also matured strategically. Iran did not lash out randomly or emotionally. Instead, it executed a targeted, high-level operation that sent a clear message while carefully avoiding reckless escalation. And the sophistication and restraint demonstrated in the strike caught many analysts off guard. Suddenly, Iran was no longer being spoken of as a backward regime, making threats from the sidelines, but as a state actor capable of delivering consequences with precision and control. This changed the diplomatic conversation, particularly in Europe, where the focus began shifting from Iran as a problem to Iran as a player that must be factored into any serious regional strategy. This new perception was reinforced by Iran's ability to pair military response with psychological impact. The timing, targets, and media framing of the operation all seemed calibrated to maximize global attention without tipping into all-out war. That kind of measured assertiveness is rare, and it signaled a government that understands how to wield influence both on the battlefield and in the information sphere. It also revealed years of preparation and quiet technological advancement, the results of which had been underestimated or ignored. As the world watched Iran carry out a response that rivaled even Western state precision warfare, the previous image of the country began to collapse. In its place emerged a portrait of a nation that had quietly invested in upgrading not just its arsenal, but its strategic mindset. This didn't mean Iran was suddenly embraced, but it was now being acknowledged in rooms where it had previously been dismissed. Among European policymakers, journalists, and military advisors, there was a clear recognition that the old ways of talking about Iran no longer fit the current reality. Iran's calculated response marked a deeper shift in the global power balance, one that went far beyond a military exchange. The impact wasn't solely in the physical strike. It was in the message it sent to nations across the world, especially those long perceived as smaller players in a superpower-dominated landscape. The psychological weight of Iran's retaliation challenged the notion that only global powers can dictate terms, exert pressure, or respond with precision. And in doing so, Iran didn't just answer an act of aggression. It redefined the rules of engagement for emerging states seeking to assert sovereignty under pressure. This was not the traditional model of asymmetric warfare that weaker nations often resort to. Instead, it was a demonstration of near-peer capability, measured, focused, and built on years of layered strategy. Iran showed that it could control the tempo, dictate the timing, and set the tone of the conflict without being baited into uncontrolled escalation. That kind of self-discipline, usually expected from Western powers, signaled that Iran was not simply reacting, but recalibrating its role in the international order. It was no longer playing defense. It was shaping the battlefield, politically and psychologically. This shift resonated far beyond the Middle East. For nations in Asia, Africa, and even parts of Latin America, the message was clear. Global influence is no longer the sole domain of nuclear-armed giants or NATO-aligned blocs. The success of Iran's strike, in terms of both precision and containment, offered a powerful example of how middle powers or sanctioned states can exercise agency through preparation, alliances, and technology. The strike created discomfort in Western capitals not just because of what it physically destroyed, but because of what it revealed about a growing multipolar reality where power is more dispersed, influence more contested, and traditional hierarchies more fragile. Europe in particular was forced to confront this new geopolitical dynamic. No longer could Iran be boxed into the threat category without also being acknowledged as a capable actor. And with that recognition came an uncomfortable truth. The global balance of power is tilting slowly but definitively. It's no longer a matter of who has the most resources, but who knows how to use them in the moment that matters most. Iran's strike was that moment, a bold, calculated move that spoke not just to its adversaries, but to a watching world, rethinking what real power looks like. The aftermath of Iran's response triggered a significant rupture in the media narrative that had long surrounded the country. For years, major Western outlets painted Iran in broad, often dismissive strokes, either as a rogue actor driven by ideology or a nation crippled by economic sanctions and incapable of modern warfare. These portrayals became a kind of accepted shorthand, shaping how both the public and policymakers perceived Iran's capability. But when Iran launched a highly coordinated and effective retaliatory strike, that media construct began to unravel in real time. Newsrooms scrambled to explain the sophistication of the operation, and suddenly the headlines took a very different tone. Less certainty, more surprise, and a noticeable shift toward acknowledging Iran's strategic depth. The precision and scale of the attack didn't fit the established script. It forced many journalists and analysts to reassess the country's technological and military standing. Iran had not simply reacted. It had done so with a level of control and execution that contradicted years of oversimplified reporting. Satellite footage, expert commentary, and government briefings all pointed to one uncomfortable conclusion. The mainstream narrative had failed to keep up with Iran's actual evolution. This mismatch between perception and reality created a credibility gap for media institutions that had relied on outdated tropes. European media, in particular, found themselves caught between traditional alignment with U.S. foreign policy and the unfolding evidence of Iran's growing regional influence. In trying to explain what had happened, reporters were forced to explore dimensions of Iranian strategy that had previously been overlooked or ignored. Terms like surgical strike, restraint, and calibrated escalation began to replace the usual rhetoric of aggression and extremism. Iran was no longer being portrayed as merely reactive, but as deliberate, rational, and capable of waging psychological warfare through optics, timing, and geopolitical calculation. This shift didn't mean the media became sympathetic to Iran, but it did reflect a turning point in how the country was framed. Editorial teams had to abandon simplistic narratives and contend with a more nuanced reality, one in which Iran was not just a regional disruptor, but a strategic actor that could embarrass and outmaneuver its adversaries. That narrative evolution rippled through television debates, newspaper columns, and international press briefings, forcing a wider audience to reconsider deeply held assumptions about who holds power and how it is exercised in today's world. Iran's unexpected and precise retaliation forced European leaders into a moment of collective reassessment. The strike wasn't just a regional event. It exposed vulnerabilities in Europe's broader security architecture and highlighted the continent's dependence on external powers for defense and intelligence. For years, European policy toward the Middle East was shaped by a balancing act, supporting U.S. deterrence strategies while maintaining diplomatic engagement with nations like Iran to protect trade routes, energy access, and regional stability. But Iran's ability to deliver a controlled and impactful strike under immense geopolitical pressure made it clear that this balance had shifted. Suddenly, European capitals had to reckon with the fact that their traditional posture of strategic distance was no longer tenable. The response served as a wake-up call in multiple dimensions. First, it challenged the notion that European security could be preserved through diplomacy alone. Iran had demonstrated that it could reshape the regional power structure without needing Western validation or mediation. Second, it raised alarm bells about Europe's continued reliance on NATO, especially the United States, for military deterrence. If a regional conflict could escalate this quickly and effectively, without NATO being able to predict or prevent it, what did that say about Europe's own readiness? Quiet discussions in Brussels and among national defense ministries began to explore the gaps in Europe's independent crisis response capabilities. In addition, the event highlighted an uncomfortable energy reality. Many European countries remain vulnerable to disruptions in Middle Eastern oil and gas routes, especially through choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. The idea that a single strike from a sanctioned state could send global energy markets into turmoil underscored just how interconnected and fragile the system remains. European leaders were reminded that distance offers no immunity in an era of missile reach, drone warfare, and cyber conflicts. The crisis accelerated talks on energy diversification, regional intelligence cooperation, and the need for faster reaction frameworks. At a political level, the retaliation fractured internal European unity. Some countries called for stronger alignment with the United States, while others urged renewed diplomatic efforts with Iran to avoid further escalation. The differing responses expose a lack of cohesive strategy when it comes to dealing with emerging powers that sit outside the traditional Western alliance structure. Iran's strike forced Europe to look inward at its fragmented policies, its delayed defense modernization, and its dependence on others to manage crises that now have direct consequences for its own security and economic stability. What the world witnessed was not just a retaliatory strike, it was a reset, a moment where the underestimated became undeniable. Iran's response didn't just echo through the deserts and skies of the Middle East, it resonated in the halls of European parliaments, in media studios, in intelligence briefings, and in the minds of global citizens everywhere. This was a statement not just of strength, but of presence, a reminder that the world is shifting, that narratives once tightly controlled are now being challenged by reality, that power isn't just about might, it's about timing, precision, restraint, and the courage to act when no one expects it. And to Europe, to the world, all those watching, this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new era where silence is strategy and response is declaration. Iran has stepped forward, and the world is still trying to catch its breath. Thank you for listening with open minds and open hearts. To those seeking truth beyond headlines and clarity beyond noise, stay sharp, stay awake, and stay bold. Because the world is changing, and you are part of that change. Good luck on your journey, and thank you.